So, we all know the movie Oppenheimer, right? One half of the Barbenheimer phenomenon had to actually recreate a nuclear explosion in real time for its filming, and also one of the most important films that Christopher Nolan has ever made. This was not only one of the biggest films of 2023, and arguably of the 21st century so far in general, but also the film that finally got Christopher Nolan his Best Picture award. This is something that he, his fans, and the film industry had really been wanting for Nolan for quite a while, since pretty infamously he was snubbed back in 2008 for the Oscar win for The Dark Knight. A lot of people that year were expecting that film to win Best Picture, but alas, it didn't, despite being arguably one of the most influential films. So finally, a decade and a half later, it seemed like Nolan had finally gotten his dues and the world was at peace again. Everyone was happy. Everyone, that is, except for one particular person, that being the YouTube channel, The Second Story. For those wondering what specifically The Second Story is, it's a writing advice channel run by the author Hillary Lane. This is a channel where she offers her personal thoughts on various modern writing and modern media, which on its own wouldn't really be a bad thing. The big issue, however, which becomes very obvious once you watch her channel for more than a few minutes, is just about how she goes about talking about modern writing, and also the problems she actually has with it and the things she thinks are legitimate issues. A lot of the supposed issues with modern writing that she brings up on her channel don't actually make much sense at all when you really look at them. She has one video on her channel talking about how she thinks every single piece of literature written by a woman since 1930 is automatically bad, which is an insane take in its own right. She's even done videos talking about how she thinks all modern heroes and all modern villains are automatically written poorly without really giving a concrete definition of what time frame she considers modern for these sort of things, while also giving the reason that she thinks all these characters are written poorly now is because society is poor now and can't figure out what morality is. Alright then. Not gonna lie, that sounds like a you problem, sister. A few of her videos have already been debunked by other creators such as Nimbus, Anthony Gramuglia, and The Haze, which I recommend checking out their videos as well since they go in depth about various subjects she tries to cover. However, for my particular take on this, I want to go back and look at Hillary's first ever video she ever made on her channel, that being about the film Oppenheimer. Because I feel like a lot of people aren't actually noticing this, but even in just her first ever video, she was already showing a ton of red flags as somebody who claims to care about writing advice. Throughout the entirety of this video she did on the film Oppenheimer, she criticizes Christopher Nolan, tries to rewrite his film for him, and also acts like various aspects of history didn't happen. Yes, you heard that right. For some reason, Hillary almost tries to rewrite history in this video of hers. It may very well be one of the most baffling videos I think I have ever seen on the platform. It's also worth noting before we actually get into this here that The Second Story really only blew up in more recent memory since about 6 months ago one of her videos was actually posted to r/Asmongold. And of course, knowing the kind of content she produces, which often is very much leaning into her right-wing ideology, Asmongold's goons ate it right up. And so of course, very quickly she went from having 50k subs to over 100k in just a matter of months. Which obviously was very good for her in the moment, but of course also exposed her to a lot more people, which was also bad for her because a lot of people noticed just how full of crap she was. This woman, despite claiming to be an author who's traveled all over the world and has over 8 billion books in her home, does not seem to understand even just basic storytelling methods whatsoever. And even here in her very first video, she was already showing this, trying to criticize Nolan for his 3 timelines narrative that he uses in Oppenheimer. Throughout the entirety of this video, she throws out a lot of different things that she seems to think would be much better than what Christopher Nolan did in this film, while not really realizing just how much this would undercut the narrative that Christopher Nolan made for this movie, and also not really seeming to realize the actual history that this film is drawing from, and also the book that it's based on called American Prometheus. American Prometheus is actually a book written on Oppenheimer that came out all the way back in 2005, and Nolan directly based his film on this book. It's even cited directly during the credits of the film. However, throughout the entirety of her video, Second Story makes it very clear she didn't actually read this book, and really also calls into question whether she actually watched the movie or not as well. So with all that preface out of the way, let's dive into Hillary's video and see just what she has to say about Nolan's Oppenheimer film. Also, I apologize if I sound a bit under the weather in this video. I am still recovering from a cold, so I hope you excuse me if the audio sounds kinda weird here sometimes.
Christopher Nolan's 3-hour, $100 million biopic about J. Robert Oppenheimer is one of the most visually impressive movies he's probably ever made. In terms of visuals alone, this film is a true masterpiece, in which Nolan's capabilities in that regard have certainly reached a peak. However, from the perspective of story and narrative, Nolan's masterpiece is a complete disaster. I have personally never seen such a beautiful film tell such a disjointed story so poorly. The level of malfunction in this film's storytelling is particularly impressive when you consider the size of its budget and the seemingly bottomless well of resources from which Nolan could draw in terms of talent. Despite all those resources and all his years of experience and shelves of accolades, Nolan has managed, somehow, to exact such a litany of offenses against the art of storytelling in the course of these 3 excruciating hours, that sitting through the thing feels more like an endurance test. It certainly doesn't feel like entertainment. Before we get into a full examination of his failures and mistakes, I should say this. In my opinion, it isn't possible to make a movie about historical figures or events that is both entertaining and historically accurate.
So right off the bat, Hillary tries to make the claim that no historical film can be both historically accurate and entertaining at the same exact time. While I think this claim on its own is something that the majority of people would disagree with that actually went to see Oppenheimer, since it did get a lot of praise by major critics for how engaging the storyline was and how well it flowed, I think actually the more interesting aspect of this is what Hillary seems to define as historically accurate. For instance, immediately after stating this, she brings up the movie Alexander starring Colin Farrell as an example of something she thinks is broadly accurate.
I have personally only heard historians praise the broad accuracy of one Hollywood film, and that was the 2004 Alexander biopic starring Colin Farrell, which I did watch somehow without passing out.
Now, notice how she very specifically worded that as broadly accurate. She didn't really break down at all what she specifically constitutes as a broadly accurate historical film. Like, what exactly do you mean by that? Do you mean it's more accurate than a movie that's completely made up and complete fiction and a fantasy? Do you mean it's less accurate than a long and careful academic history documentary? Because ultimately, saying something is broadly accurate isn't really giving a specific definition of just how historically accurate it really is, because honestly, that's kind of a very hard question to actually answer. The real way to go into something like this when talking about historical fiction would be looking at more specific events and asking more specific questions. Like, for example, in the case of Oppenheimer, we can ask, what events do we know actually happened? For example, President Truman and Oppenheimer did have a meeting, and we know that based on actual historical fact. And what things do we not know about their meeting? For example, we don't really know what Truman said to Oppenheimer during that meeting. The film chooses to depict President Truman calling Oppenheimer a crybaby in this part of the film.
Mr. President, I feel that I have blood on my hands.
Don't let that crybaby back in here.
But the truth is, we don't really know what was said between these two men specifically during their meeting together. So no matter what, any adaptation of Oppenheimer's story that is specifically tackling this event would have to sort of fill in the blanks for what was said between Truman and Oppenheimer. But for some reason, Hillary doesn't really seem to understand this and tries to claim Oppenheimer isn't broadly accurate, which really doesn't make sense as a criticism against this film. Or really any historical film for that matter, for exactly the reasons I just stated.
Real life doesn't lend itself well to narrative arcs and even pacing. And outside of that, historical inaccuracies, while they might sour the experience for anyone with even a passing knowledge of the history as it happened, do not themselves constitute bad storytelling. I've seen Hollywood films about historical figures that were so far removed from the facts that they were entirely fictional. But they were also very good movies. Why? Because they told a story. A fictional story, mind you, very well. Because at the end of the day, any film, no matter the subject matter or genre, must do only one thing well: tell a story.
Okay, so then what exactly was the point of this entire aside if really what matters with a film is that it's a good film and not necessarily historical accuracy? Hillary claims here the thing that matters the most in a film is storytelling, which arguably isn't true in of itself here, because really there's a lot of factors that go into a film overall. Storytelling definitely being a big one, but also things like cinematography, casting, pacing, and so many other factors that come into making a film in general. But even if we're just going by her definition here that storytelling is the only thing that matters in a film, then her entire aside that she just went on made no sense where she was talking non-stop about historical accuracy. She's actually spent the entire first 2 minutes and 30 seconds of her review here saying this, only to say at the very end of that it doesn't matter. This woman literally just went in an entire big circle. It's kind of amazing that she can start off the first 2 minutes of her video talking non-stop like this without really saying anything at all or arriving at a real point. It honestly makes me wonder whether she actually has a script that she's laid out for this video or not, because it seems like a lot of her talking points feel rather aimless and kind of meandering. It's certainly something to say the least, but believe it or not, we haven't even arrived at the best parts yet whatsoever.
I want to make this abundantly clear. This is not going to be a video about whether or not Nolan's film is true to historical facts. When it comes to history, if there's electricity and men are wearing neckties, I probably don't know that much, given that my interest is ancient and medieval history. But again, not really relevant to storytelling.
Once again, then why exactly did you bring that up at the start of your video? If storytelling really is the thing that matters most to you, why do you keep bringing up historical accuracy? You even just admitted here you're not a historical expert at all. And believe it or not, this won't be the only time she does this, so just wait for the next one. After this, however, Hillary decides to talk about the things that she thinks make Christopher Nolan a hack of a director, including pacing and complexity. Well, let's see what she had to say on that in particular.
My area is storytelling, and it is in his storytelling that Nolan's failure with Oppenheimer is the most glaring. It took me 3 watches to break down in my mind the specific places and ways this story fails. The whole 3-hour thing was such a disjointed mess that I felt like I'd been handed a box of puzzle pieces that could make 2 or 3 separate images, but I had no way of knowing what those images were even supposed to be. Which leads us to our first and most glaring problem: pacing and complexity. And when it comes to complexity, Nolan's in this film was on a Byzantine level, both in terms of its overabundance and the way it had a tendency to undermine itself. A helpful rule about complexity is that it must be limited, and the way you limit complexity is to balance it with simplicity.
What? Where in the world did you hear that rule? This is honestly such a baffling thing to hear from Hillary because, first of all, most artists or directors will just follow their own sort of set of instincts or rules, if you really want to call it that, from when they're making a film. Some of Christopher Nolan's own personal instincts or trademarks of his filmmaking style often is utilizing a non-linear form of storytelling, although this isn't always the case. The entirety of the Dark Knight trilogy is all linear storytelling, and so is something like Insomnia as well. Heck, even The Prestige, even though the beginning does showcase a segment for the middle of the film, actually is mostly a very linear story. So firstly, trying to claim that Nolan only does non-linear stories is kind of an insane claim in its own right when that's so easily disprovable, but also trying to claim that limiting complexity is a rule of filmmaking doesn't really make much sense either. Like, look at any Kubrick film. Many of his films are considered some of the greatest American films of all time and are often very complex and able to be interpreted a number of ways. The complexity is definitely not limited in those films at all, but that doesn't stop them from being great films. So this doesn't really make any sense here as a quote-unquote rule for stories in film. It's honestly kind of insane for Hillary to say that either of these things are true when it's very clear they just aren't.
This is where you'll run into issues where, for instance, a character's identity isn't clear enough to the audience to allow them to care whether or not they live or die in a particularly climactic scene. And this will just annoy your audience, or even worse, bore them. A writer has to be prudent in their use of complexity and ambiguity.
Okay, so this is also an insane claim, because not only do the stakes in Oppenheimer not really involve characters living or dying, but also everyone I've talked to that watched Oppenheimer and actually paid attention to the movie could actually tell me what the movie was about after having seen it. It's honestly crazy to me that Hillary, who seems to pride herself on claiming to be an authority on storytelling, doesn't seem to have actually paid attention to this movie very much at all to get its story. Just about everybody who has actually seen Oppenheimer and actually locked in and paid attention to the film can tell you the story of it. There are 3 timelines in the film, but they don't really undercut each other at all, and if anything, they kind of help the story flow very naturally and they help accelerate it in a different way. So what Hillary is saying here kind of makes it look like she didn't actually watch the movie, or at the very least didn't pay enough attention to it. It's hard to say for sure, but it sure is wild hearing her say this nonetheless.
I'm not the first person, nor will I be the last, to point out that Christopher Nolan has become far too reliant on his unconventional, increasingly complex, non-linear approach to narrative. I would go so far as to claim that this strategy only really worked for him twice. The first was his 2000 film Memento starring Guy Pearce, in which the entire story was told in reverse. And the second, of course, was Inception. A big part of the success of the non-linear timelines here was the fact that both films featured time itself as a major plot point, as in Interstellar, though that plot was a lot more linear than these two other examples. In all of his films since then, these strange timeline decisions have felt more like a gimmick.
Okay, so Hillary brings up that she thinks every single film of Nolan since Interstellar relies too heavily on non-linear storytelling and it makes it too complex and too confusing. And she seems to think this undercuts the story as well, and she actually shows a picture of Dunkirk here as a brief example, supposedly. But all she does is flash an image of Dunkirk up briefly on the screen and doesn't actually explain why she thinks the three timelines in that film don't work at all. If you really feel that way when I make a claim like that, then you should have something to back it up with, or at least a way to explain why you feel that way. It's completely understandable if you don't like the non-linear storytelling in Dunkirk, but for some reason Hillary didn't actually explain at all why she feels that way. She just seemingly aimlessly made that claim and then is just moving on to her next point here. She gave no real explanation for that whatsoever and didn't go in depth at all about what exactly doesn't work about Dunkirk. This has gotta be some of the worst attempt at criticism I've ever seen, because you gotta actually criticize something to claim you're making a video about criticism. It's pretty apparent to everybody at home that you didn't do that at all. It's like if I told you I was gonna deliver you a box of donuts and then came to your door with an empty box. I promised you something initially, but when it came down to it, I wasn't able to provide it at all and came up empty-handed, and now you have nothing to dunk in your coffee. Just like how Hillary seems to have no grasp on how to criticize anything here, just is coming off like she has a massive hate boner for Christopher Nolan more than anything else. The grift is absolutely real.
And in Oppenheimer, this particular narrative strategy did a tremendous amount of damage to an already flagging story. So in order to analyze that, we need to take a quick look at the three timelines at play in this film. The first, let's call it the linear biographical timeline, begins long before World War II, when J. Robert Oppenheimer was still just a university student struggling to cope with genius, mental instability, academic humiliation, and the general pain of coming into his own intellectually. This timeline continued through his journeys across European academia, until he returned home to America to start his own celebrated teaching career. It then brought us into World War II and the splitting of the atom, and then, of course, the Manhattan Project. It wrapped up somewhere around the dropping of the bombs on Japan. The second timeline, let's call this one the security hearing timeline, takes place some years after the war when Oppenheimer's security clearance is being thoroughly reevaluated by the Gray Board. This security hearing timeline was meant to act as a kind of contextual clearinghouse for the information that was being revealed in the course of the first timeline, the biographical timeline. That seemed to be the intent, but it failed to do this. The third and final timeline, we'll call it the
Let's just back it up a moment.
Wait, what? Are you gonna explain how it failed to do that? Hillary just made the claim that the second timeline in the film doesn't work as a contextual clearinghouse for the first timeline in the film. But the thing is, she just made that claim and didn't back it up at all. She literally moved on to the third timeline after saying that. The least you could do is at least try to explain why you think the second timeline failed, but you didn't even do that. We've already seen her do this once before, but this is a thing you'll see her do a lot throughout this video. She'll make a claim and then not really back up why she thinks that way at all, or even bother to explain it in the least. This is what makes her look so incompetent as a critic, because she can't actually back up anything she says or explain it further whatsoever. Seemingly, she's aimlessly throwing out random points that she thinks sound like a real criticism about the film, but she doesn't actually explain why she thinks that way at all, or how it is a real criticism. If you can't actually explain any of the points you're trying to make about a film, or really any other piece of media, then you're not really a very good critic. It's honestly kind of baffling just how incompetent she's actually coming off here as a critic, especially as someone who claims to be a published author, which we'll get into that later.
The third and final timeline, we'll call it the Strauss timeline, takes place at a time loosely understood to be 4 or 5 years after the security clearance reevaluation. This one, for no particular reason, is filmed in black and white and features prominently Robert Downey Jr. playing the role of Louis Strauss, who is up for a cabinet appointment as Secretary of Commerce and is being himself routinely evaluated by the appropriate subcommittee. Given his involvement in Oppenheimer's life, especially after the war, this evaluation is dominated by questions about that. These three timelines are interspersed largely at random.
No, the events in these timelines are not interspliced into each other at random at all. For those who have seen Oppenheimer, you probably know that the film actually starts off showing a scene from what Hillary refers to here as the security hearing timeline. It's in this timeline that Oppenheimer himself is having his security clearance re-examined by different members of the board after World War II is already ended. This is also part of a coup organized against him by General Strauss. But of course, at least at this point in the film, we the audience don't know that yet, since his intentions haven't been properly revealed to us. After initially introducing us to the security hearing timeline, we get to see a scene scene from the Strauss timeline, as Hillary calls it here. Like Hillary said, the Strauss timeline is shown in all black and white, but unlike what she said, there is a real reason as for why it is shown like this. The main timeline that actually holds the film together actually is the main security hearing timeline, since throughout this timeline we see different flashbacks of Oppenheimer's past showing how he got to this exact moment in time. And throughout this, we are shown little snippets of the Strauss timeline as well, which technically acts as an epilogue to the film itself. This epilogue is meant to give the film somewhat of a satisfying ending, showing that Strauss didn't actually get away with his coup against Oppenheimer by the end of it all. So it does actually make sense to be included in this overall narrative. So despite Hillary's claims that she thinks the Strauss timeline is totally unnecessary and that all these different segments are interposed at random, that doesn't really make any sense as a criticism against this film for exactly what I just stated here. It's very clear the way these timelines were organized and interposed with each other was very intentional on Nolan's part. And it's actually what makes the overall narrative flow very well, since each timeline complements the other. As a result, by the time you get to the end of the film, the complete picture totally makes sense to you. But for some reason, it didn't seem to make sense to Hillary at all, which really makes you wonder if she was actually watching this film at all.
At this point, I feel a little confused explaining this, so I wouldn't be surprised if you're a little confused listening to me, and that's my problem here. There was no need for this to be this confusing. All these overlapping, interconnected timelines offered nothing to the narrative, to our understanding of the events, to our understanding of the character's development. All it does is force the audience to work double time, trying to keep all the events straight. When every scene opens, we have to take several valuable seconds trying to understand where this scene fits in the narrative, whether it happened before or after everything else we've seen thus far. And during those valuable seconds, we've missed either plot details or emotional information. The audience can be made to work hard to understand a story as the writer is delivering it, and most audiences will really enjoy doing so, but the audience should never be made to work longer to understand a story. The writer has to know for certain how hard the average audience member is working to understand a bit of his clever ambiguity, and he has to gauge whether or not it's too much. The writer can make things just the right amount of vague, but that cannot undermine the surrounding narrative information. Among the many things not made clear is which of these three timelines is the film's present, which could seem like a somewhat irrelevant concern to have about a film that is set entirely in our past, but the issue is that the film itself isn't grounded anywhere. There is no solid home base, so to speak.
No, the film does make very clear that the security hearing timeline is the central timeline that everything else is spawning from. That's exactly why it's the first timeline that's actually shown to us in the movie. That's exactly why flashbacks from Oppenheimer's past actually are shown that spawn from this timeline, and also that's why the epilogue acts as a cap-off to it as well. It's really not that hard to understand at all if you actually watch the movie, Hillary.
Initially, I expected the security hearing timeline to be the film's present, from which solid position we would occasionally reach back into the past.
Huh? But that's exactly what happens in the film. During the entirety of the security hearing timeline, we see a lot of different flashbacks showing Oppenheimer's past and how he got to this moment in time. I am fully convinced now that Hillary didn't actually watch this film because this is telegraphed very clearly at the start of it. After we're introduced to the two initial timelines, that being the security hearing timeline and the Strauss timeline, we see another segment from the security hearing timeline where someone asks Oppenheimer about his time in Cambridge. In particular, he's asked if he was happier there than he was in America. Of course, he says no, and we immediately start seeing flashbacks from his time at Cambridge, which is a part of his past.
But first I had to go to Europe. I went to Cambridge to study under Patrick Blackett.
Were you happier there than in America?
No.
This kicks off what Hillary called the linear biographical timeline. And throughout this timeline, we see lots of different flashbacks from Oppenheimer's past, which is exactly what she said didn't happen here. This is completely insane. This happened right at the start of the film, yet apparently Hillary didn't notice that at all. This is genuinely wild to me, especially since the first 5 minutes of this film very quickly and very efficiently establish all three of these timelines. You would genuinely not have to be paying attention to the first 5 minutes of this movie to not understand this.
However, chronologically, the timeline that takes place the latest, the black and white Strauss timeline, would probably be the present, but that hardly seems likely considering that the events depicted there felt more like an unnecessary epilogue to the events of the other two timelines.
No, the epilogue isn't actually unnecessary at all. The Strauss timeline acts as a way to give closure to the audience in showing that Strauss didn't get away with trying to do this coup against Oppenheimer the whole time throughout the film. That's the entire point of that timeline's existence in the movie.
Lack of solid ground in Nolan's Oppenheimer isn't the world's biggest problem by any means, but it unfortunately lays the shaky foundation for the instability that would plague the rest of the story. If you're using multiple chronological timelines to tell a story, then one of them has to be base camp. A very straightforward example of this would be a story that opens with an old dying man telling his life story to a visitor. The opening scene begins his account, and then the rest of the story is the story as he tells it. At the end, or perhaps occasionally throughout the narrative, we could return to the old man and his visitor. And we're returning because this is home camp, and we need to, as the writers, remind the audience of the chronological context of the rest of the events.
The thing is, though, what Hillary just described here is quite literally what actually happens in the movie. The example she gave here about an old man telling a story and then the reader being shown that story while also cutting back to the old man every now and then is quite literally what happens with Oppenheimer at the security hearing timeline as well. He's talking about his life and his past, and we cut back every now and then to the security hearing timeline, which is home base. The example she just gave is quite literally the same exact setup as Oppenheimer's two timelines there, but she doesn't seem to realize that at all. It also just so happens that Oppenheimer is a much more in-depth story about a real person in history than a fictionalized tale about an old man in a jail cell.
Pardon my creative digression, but I think it's helpful to really examine specifically why Nolan's use of multiple timelines didn't work in Oppenheimer. All of these timelines were doubtless meant to reinforce each other, but instead they undercut each other. The three were so weak that when they leaned against each other, their individual uncertainty damaged the cohesion of the others. And this weakness came from primarily a lack of focus. Where was the main avenue of Nolan's narrative? Which timeline was his home base?
Oh my gosh, you really can't seem to let go of this for some reason. We've already established that home base was the security hearing timeline, but Hillary still doesn't seem to get that.
Contextually, how did they interconnect both chronologically and thematically? These were all areas where he failed, and his failure probably came from the fact that he himself likely couldn't answer these questions. Thus, the ambiguity in his finished narrative wasn't ambiguity, it was accidental confusion, which would have probably been avoidable had he decided not to use more than one timeline. I'm going to cover this a little more later, but a part of this problem of his is that he couldn't focus on any particular part of Oppenheimer's life and seems to almost be trying to cover all of it. But I mean, as any storyteller knows, no individual—
Yes, that's literally the point of the movie. The film focuses on three major aspects of Oppenheimer's life, that being his early life at Cambridge and what led him to creating the atomic bomb, the security hearing timeline, and also the coup that was placed against him, and later on, the epilogue that shows him in his later years and the legacy that he left behind for himself. While the film isn't covering all of Oppenheimer's life, it is hitting three major aspects of that, but unfortunately, Hillary doesn't seem to get that either.
In my humble opinion, a better way to tell the story would have been from within the security clearance reevaluation hearing. The opening of the film could have been the days when Oppenheimer, his lawyers, his friends, his wife were all trying to prepare him for the hearing. The opening scene could have been the instance at Louis Strauss's house when Oppenheimer was alerted to the fact that accusations had been made against him. We could have then had several scenes that could slowly but steadily build tension in anticipation of the hearing, hints at possible betrayals by friends and colleagues, while other friends looked on grieved as this cruel deed was carried out, all while his lawyers struggled to learn the details of what had called into question Oppenheimer's trustability. There was some really fascinating behind-the-scenes scheming taking place that would have translated really well to a fictionalized narrative, something not unlike a courtroom drama. That said, courtroom dramas do traditionally tend to end well, and this hearing did not end well for Oppenheimer.
Which, again, is exactly why the Strauss timeline does exist in this film. It's meant to be an epilogue to the overall story and give somewhat of a happier ending to Oppenheimer's narrative overall. What you just described here does happen exactly in the film, but only in the part you deemed an unnecessary addition, which is exactly why you didn't want to acknowledge that.
The Chevalier incident, for example. And the fact that the audience doesn't all know this information isn't because they're stupid, but because the story is told very poorly. And dismissing critical reviewers' complaints about this film being confusing or boring as merely the whining of stupid people is like those teachers who pride themselves on having a lot of students who can't pass their class. Little realizing, apparently, that this indicates a failure on their part as teachers, or in this case, a failure on Nolan's part as a storyteller. For instance, the scene in which Oppenheimer humiliated Strauss in front of Congress should have been delivered at the crest of a pacing hill, as the culmination in a tensely depicted uncertain friendship between two arrogant and politically powerful men. Strauss himself could have made appearances in the security hearing timeline, and then too in the course of the biographical timeline.
The thing is, the film does show Oppenheimer and Strauss together in various flashbacks that take place before the security hearing timeline. These flashbacks take place during a time when Oppenheimer and his team find out that there's been a Russian spy amongst them, and now Russia is developing atomic warfare as well. Oppenheimer was the one who put together the team that was initially developing the atomic bomb in secret in a remote part of New Mexico, so naturally this causes strife between him and Strauss. However, he and we the audience don't actually figure out how dire this affected his relationship with Strauss until later in the film when Strauss is revealed to be a twist villain.
That was his mistake.
He was the one who set up the coup against Oppenheimer and started the entire security hearings against him to begin with. So the film does foreshadow the falling out between Oppenheimer and Strauss, but for some reason Hillary seems to have missed this as well.
In fact, the entire black and white Strauss timeline in which he plays the big bad slimy politician villain should have been completely scrapped, partly because it did terrible damage to the flow and rhythm of the rest of the story, and partly because it wasn't necessary, given that the events relayed by it, the relevant ones anyway, could have easily been shown in the timeline with the security hearing, especially if you consider that it was William Borden's actions that forced the hearing to even take place. William Borden, by the way, and this was never made clear, was the former executive director of the Joint Congressional Committee on Atomic Energy. Not that Nolan thought we needed to know that. The letter that Borden sent that got the ball rolling for the hearing was to the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, though it did eventually make it to the desk of President Eisenhower. Historically speaking, Strauss didn't give Oppenheimer's damning security file to Borden. He wouldn't have done that politically. He wouldn't have wanted any of that information anywhere in the open. This security file was probably the one, at least in part, that had been shipped to the FBI by Leslie Groves, and which Hoover was deliberately keeping on a shelf too high for Senator McCarthy to reach, because anyone back then with 2/5 of a brain knew that it would be a political disaster for McCarthy to start publicly tearing into Oppenheimer. Everyone in Oppenheimer's radius would be damaged, from Louis Strauss all the way up to the Oval Office. For his part, Borden seemed like a true believer and not a political puppet, but this is all getting dangerously close to an analysis of historical accuracy, and as I've already mentioned, not my area.
Then why in the world did you spend the past 2 minutes trying to talk about historical accuracy and how things actually happen? Once again, just like she already did at the start of this video, despite Hillary making the claim she wasn't going to talk about historical accuracy in this video, she already has done that yet again. She made the claim at the start she was only going to be focusing on storytelling, only to get sidetracked twice about historical accuracy, which, as I said before, as a broad statement, isn't really an answerable thing to begin with. But she's also failed at all to really talk about how the storytelling in Oppenheimer is really a bad thing at all and how it actually destroys the narrative, as I've already discussed here. We're literally 20 minutes into her video so far and she has done nothing to actually prove that Chris Nolan is a hack of a director or writer at all. What?
Anyway, there's that terrible line in Strauss's timeline when that younger man finally realized that Strauss was behind Oppenheimer's humiliating crucifixion, and he says something like, "Borden was holding the knife for you." Strauss hadn't wanted a knife to even be necessary. A politician getting rid of a political rival will want to make sure not just that his fingerprints aren't on the murder weapon, but that no one thinks a murder has even taken place. Borden writing his letter almost ruined all of Strauss's plans. I have a pretty big problem with Nolan's reinterpretation of the nefarious scheming behind the security hearing that destroyed Oppenheimer, not because it is a grossly inaccurate understanding of the historical nuances of the events.
She's going back to history yet again. I thought she said she was done doing this. This is now the third time she's tried to talk about broad historical accuracy instead of actually addressing the story like she claimed she wanted to. This is completely wild.
Nolan created a fictional political scheme to bizarrely replace a very similar political scheme that already existed and attempted to staple it to non-fiction facts that were only loosely present in his film's narrative.
Wow, the fourth time now. This is honestly pretty funny, but also genuinely crazy that she keeps doing this. Clearly, broad historical accuracy isn't something that matters to you in this film, right? That's why you brought it up 4 times now.
Anyway, there's that terrible line in Strauss's timeline when that younger man finally realized that Strauss was behind Oppenheimer's humiliating crucifixion, and he says something like, "Borden was holding the knife for you."
Wait, what? What was terrible about that line? You mind elaborating on that? It's totally valid if you think the line was bad somehow, even though it does make sense in the narrative, but you didn't really explain why you think it's bad. This is the line that's directed at Strauss when he's revealed to be a twist villain, so it does kind of make sense for its placement here in the story.
That was his mistake.
What exactly is bad about that? You didn't really explain that at all.
This was an area where Nolan pulled entire pieces of fiction out of his hat in an effort to make the story more dramatic.
Wow, the 5th time now that she's brought up historical accuracy instead of talking about the thing she claimed she wanted to talk about. Take a shot every time she does this in the video. You'll probably be passed out before it's even over.
Which is fine, he's welcome to do that, but his version lacks logic and any sense of political nuance.
What exactly do you mean by political nuance here? Do you mind defining what that means to you exactly? This is something she said twice now when talking about this aspect of the film, but she hasn't really explained what she means by that. It feels like it's just a buzzword she's throwing around, if anything. If she's talking about the motivations that Strauss had for getting rid of Oppenheimer, then yeah, that's shown pretty clearly in the film. Strauss doesn't want Oppenheimer to be seen as a martyr or somebody seen in a good light by the public for what he did to Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
He could do it all over. He'd do it all the same. You know he's never once said that he regrets Hiroshima? He'd do it all over. Why? Because it made him the most important man who ever lived.
He is also incredibly envious of all the quote-unquote glory that Oppenheimer got from people in general in the political sphere. Around this time, Oppenheimer was also speaking out against the US using the Los Alamos facility that he'd set up to develop further weapons, which kept getting denied. In order to silence Oppenheimer and make sure he didn't have a platform to speak out against these things anymore, Strauss deliberately set up the security hearings as a means of doing this. This is explained deliberately in the film, which is a nuanced political conflict, so if that's what Hillary is referring to here, then yeah, that's also in the movie. She also didn't expound at all on what she means by political nuance, so her point here also doesn't really make any sense in that regard too.
It feels like the silly, half-wrought villain scheme in a cheap paperback sword and sorcery novel from the 70s, right down to the way Nolan gave Strauss an evil supervillain monologue. The idea that Strauss was some black-caped goon, evil enough and important enough to warrant his own timeline is very doubtful. Instead, his scheming and backroom manipulations regarding the hearing could have been shown or hinted at within the security hearing timeline itself.
This doesn't really make any sense as a complaint for two reasons. One, like I said before, they do foreshadow Strauss being a twist villain throughout the security hearing timeline quite a bit.
That was his mistake.
It's not incredibly on the nose, but it is subtle enough so that when they actually get to the reveal, it does make sense when you look at everything that happened between him and Oppenheimer. Two, if they'd had the big reveal or just even been more on the nose about Strauss being the main villain during the security hearing timeline, that would completely kill the reveal towards the end. It would make it nowhere near as impactful as it actually is with the way the story is actually set up. This is an absolutely mind-boggling take here.
If Nolan had had a better understanding of the political landscape of the time, or of politics in general, he could have written Borden as someone who was deeply unsettled by the presence of a person he deemed a significant security threat on the AEC, or in the political sphere at all. And he could have been angry that Strauss was failing to forcibly remove Oppenheimer for merely political self-preservation. And so Borden could have drafted his letter to Hoover with full knowledge that it would damage Strauss as well.
Wow, that's the sixth time now for those counting at home that she's brought up actual history instead of just focusing on storytelling like she said she was gonna at the start of this video. If you're taking shots of vodka, then more than likely you're already legally drunk over there. I cannot believe how many times Hillary has deliberately gone back on her word here. The hypocrisy is genuinely insane.
I didn't myself completely understand the relevant protocol or the sequence of events until I looked into the actual history as it occurred. Moreover, these relevant protocols and sequences of events are introduced, begun, and then interrupted for some other narrative line which launches us back into wartime at the Manhattan Project, further damaging the audience's grasp not just of the sequential order of events, but of the causes and effects. None of which, by the way, was fully comprehensible to me even after several watches, until I spent the better part of a month thoroughly researching all aspects of these events and the people involved.
Well, maybe if you'd actually paid attention to this film, you wouldn't feel the need to look up outside material about the actual history behind it for the better part of a month, Hillary. Imagine wasting your time looking up all this material for a month instead of just watching a 3-hour film and actually paying attention to it and seeing how its story flows. Couldn't be me.
Which isn't even my area of historical interest, so I'm still a little annoyed about it. This brings us to Nolan's second major storytelling problem: contextual ambiguity. One of the things I noticed throughout the film was that you can't really appreciate the portrayed events unless you already know the history. But if you already know the history, then you can't really appreciate the portrayed events.
What? What do you mean you can't appreciate the events in the film if you already know the history, and vice versa? Plenty of people did not know the full history behind this film going into it, but they still loved it. It made almost $1 billion. times. And plenty of critics liked it too. It's now considered one of the greatest films of the 21st century even. Are you really gonna tell me that this film's relation in history stopped people from enjoying it? Not to mention, this now marks the 7th time you brought up history despite the fact you claimed you were gonna do that. Make sure you drink responsibly, y'all. I sure hope the room isn't spinning around you back at home with all this hypocrisy from Hillary here. I think I'm gonna start calling the counter up above Hillary's hypocrisy on history counter just for the heck of it. Say that 5 times fast.
The film's story and environment were not self-sustaining, which is a big reason why people with historical knowledge of the era find it so frustrating. Because if only half the context is on screen and it's supposed to be supported by historical facts, but those historical facts are manifestly wrong, the whole film collapses like a house of cards. Reliance on erroneous historical details is magically no longer a storytelling problem if you make your narrative entirely self-contained and self-sufficient. Nolan failed in this by accidentally keeping a lot of details and facts extremely contextually unclear. And again, look elsewhere for an in-depth analysis of the historical aspects of this film. I'm here to explain why this lack of self-contained contextual certainty made this story so bad.
Well, you sure could have fooled me given the fact you keep bringing up historical fact as though it's a knock against this film, even though, as I've already stated, it really isn't.
For one thing, events were revealed in a strange sequence, as if Nolan was relying on his audience's knowledge of history to reinforce his narrative with the hard facts that he was choosing not to relate, for whatever reason.
No, I don't think Nolan was expecting his audience to know the history behind this story whatsoever. You can absolutely go into this film knowing nothing about the full history of J. Robert Oppenheimer, and this will still be a very in-depth, entertaining, and introspective ride for you no matter what. Most people who saw this film ended up testifying to that fact.
This speaks to the idea that Nolan wasn't so much interested in telling a story as he was in conveying a sense of his character's mind and soul, perhaps.
The thing is, Nolan was telling a real story here, but a lot of that story was also directly peering into Oppenheimer's mind and soul and seeing how he felt leading up to developing the first atomic bomb, and also how its aftermath directly affected his psyche and overall his view on nuclear warfare. He'd realized the consequences of what he unleashed upon the world and wasn't really sure what to do going forward. This is exactly why he started speaking out against further development of nuclear weapons at Los Alamos. What Hillary doesn't really seem to understand is that peering into a character's mind and soul, as she puts it, and also a real story can completely coincide with each other and complement each other too. That's exactly what happens in this film as we peer into Oppenheimer's psyche throughout various periods of his life. We see where his mentality was before developing the bomb and where it ended up after it.
Which might even make a good film under the right circumstances, but is objectively always going to be the wrong choice when it comes to biopics.
What do you mean that's the wrong choice for most biopics? A lot of biopics also follow this formula as well. Something like Better Man, a biopic about the singer Robbie Williams from last year, does exactly this, for example. We see Robbie as a young person and how his mentality was as a child before he got famous, and over time we see how fame changed him and made him less of a good person and also damaged his morality. And it also damaged how he treated those around him. Something like Saving Mr. Banks also explores this with the British author P.L. Travers, who wrote Mary Poppins, and her meeting with Walt Disney as he attempted to get the rights to her books for his films. This film explores through various flashbacks how P.L. Travers' childhood ended up affecting her life as an adult and how she can't really seem to seek out fun anymore. She had a wildly traumatic childhood that affected the way she views the world now as an adult. And this is something that is explored and she ends up reconciling with after her meetings with Walt Disney. Plenty of biopics, even apart from the two I just mentioned here, directly do this, peering into the person in question's mind and soul. Why Hillary thinks this is something a biopic shouldn't do is honestly quite baffling given the fact that most biopics follow this formula exactly.
Oppenheimer's life is data heavy, more so than, say, the life of Henry David Thoreau, for example. If we're expected to follow the story as Nolan wants to tell it, we're going to need a lot of hard facts, and we're going to need to understand the relevance of those facts and how they fit into the history of the world, the history of science, and the history of atomic politics at the time. So unless he intended to hand out a booklet with every ticket, he'd need to convey that information within the narrative. And if nothing else, please, for the love of God, give us a date or two. This lack of context went as far as many of the top-billed characters, who were presented as if Nolan expected us to already have a working encyclopedic knowledge of all the major and minor players of the American mid-century physics and nuclear science scene. Countless individuals were presented with just a nickname, or a first name, or no name at all, and a significant amount of admittedly easy historical sleuthing was required for me to understand who everyone was and why they were relevant. The idea, however, that I had to do that represented a gross mishandling of the most basic requirements of storytelling.
Oh my gosh, Hillary really went out of her way for no reason whatsoever. For example, the character she's showing here, Harlan Snyder, isn't really focused upon in the film at all. I went back and rewatched the film in preparation for this video, and he literally only has 2 scenes in the entire film and is barely in it. It's so crazy to me that a woman that claims she cares more about storytelling than historical accuracy went out of her way to look up the name of every single historical character in this film, even ones that barely appeared in the film. It feels like she's completely going all over the place here, and the things she's bringing up are really aimless and don't really have anything to do with each other whatsoever. She first claimed she didn't want to talk about history, but has now brought up history about 9 times. She's trying to claim that too much complexity makes a story bad when that doesn't really make any sense on its own either for the reasons I already brought up. She tried to act like it's some unnamed rule that all biopics shouldn't focus on a character's mind and soul, which also doesn't make sense for also the reasons I already brought up. This is such a painfully disorganized video, and it's genuinely mind-blowing to me. As a result of just how meandering this whole thing has been, she has yet to make one single strong criticism against the film at all. It feels more like her trying to nitpick, if anything, and not even doing a good job at that.
And yes, it is difficult to put forward a tremendous amount of historical context in the course of a fictional narrative without it coming across like the writer striding into the frame and addressing the audience. But it is possible. Hard, but possible. I've seen historical films in which a character is introduced and a non-invasive card appears briefly on the screen, relaying the character's name and occupation.
But why does it matter when the characters you're bringing up barely have any presence in the film at all? Do you really think that Christopher Nolan is gonna come on camera and give us a 5-minute exposition about who Harlan Snyder is? Yeah, me neither. Funny your own personal card there says storytelling snob when, once again, you've barely brought up storytelling at all throughout the entirety of this video so far. And also, when you have, you've made it very clear you don't actually understand that much at all about storytelling.
Even this is preferable to no context at all. Context allows the audience to have a handhold, and with this many characters and too many timelines, handholds are crucial. Context isn't just historical or chronological, it's also part of character building. A character's actions need context in order for those actions to be used to define the character. If a character is depicted with blood on his hands, the meaning is different if he's a surgeon or a serial killer. Those are the context. In fiction, these choices are left entirely up to the writer depending on the type of character they want to construct. In works based on nonfiction, these contextual character development choices have to serve the story or the audience's understanding of the character. Thus, even if the event or the context is historically inaccurate, it has to be true to who the person was at that point in their life. Or it has to serve to help the audience understand how that character is developing.
Yes, that's exactly what the film does with the character of Oppenheimer. In the leading up to the making of the bomb, and eventually the dropping of it, we see Oppenheimer developing as a person. We see him go through 2 different love lives and also contemplate whether it's worth it to make this sort of weapon to begin with, but eventually he does go through with it. And after the bomb is dropped, we see how that affects his psyche and now how he fears what he's unleashed upon the world and what that will do to others around him. He fears exactly how this new kind of weaponry that he helped create will affect the world now that it's out there. It is shown very clearly in the film if you actually watch it, which, as we said before, it's very clear Hillary didn't, or if she did, she was focusing on the wrong stuff, like this random guy holding a newspaper.
In a way, aside from his scientific awareness and the facts of his life, I feel that Nolan's interpretation of Oppenheimer was unchanged throughout the film. He was at the same development point in Cambridge as he was before the AEC Grey Board. He might have said that he was different in one way or another, but the portrayal on screen was consistent with his character during the hearing and during the Manhattan Project.
No, he really wasn't the same during the events of the Grey Board as he was during the start of the film in Cambridge. As I said before, the film does very distinctly show how dropping the bomb and being the maker of it really affected his psyche. That's exactly why he started using his platform to try to lobby against further development of this kind of weaponry to begin with. If he'd really stayed the exact same as he had been at the very start of the film, then he wouldn't be lobbying against the very thing that he spent most of the film developing. It's very clear he changed his mind about it all. This makes no sense at all coming from Hillary here.
And instead of hard facts, the audience is then offered only these repeated imaginings of Oppenheimer's scientific hallucinations, interspersed with cinematic landscapes of his string of colleges and universities, and the occasional soundless shot of another professor at a chalkboard, all within a building orchestral crescendo that would suggest a certain narrative peak. But all this was, at best, an emotional array of gauzy set dressing, within which, inexplicably, Oppenheimer's obvious instability and misery was somehow mitigated with each new European slice of theoretical physics pie, until he returned to America fortified with the sense of mission that accompanied his desire to bring this science back to his own people. Somehow, though we don't know how, he is freed from the crushing weight of whatever ambiguous instability had been ambiguously threatening to ruin him, as if the science itself was healing him. Somehow, though we don't know how, he achieves not just stability but recognition and acclaim, enough to earn him multiple respected teaching positions. One would think that the details of his rise to respected prominence within the theoretical physics world would be, perhaps, a useful piece of information, but apparently not.
That's not the point though. We don't need to see every job and every position that Oppenheimer took to get him to the academic position that he's in at that point in the film to really see him develop as a person and see his psyche change over time. You're completely missing the point here, and despite your claim, you're kind of missing the storytelling of this film as well. I just cannot believe this woman at all. She is so hung up on tiny, minute details that she seems to think should have been included in the narrative for some reason, when really it doesn't make any sense for those kinds of things to be touched on for very long at all anyway. Ironically enough, despite her claim that Nolan's 3 timelines is undercutting the narrative and making it very bogged down, the things she's suggesting should have been put in this narrative actually would have been things that would have bogged down the narrative and made it way too messy. The kind of advice she's giving here is literally the opposite of what she's saying this film actually is. She is completely contradicting herself here, and it's kind of amazing, especially since she doesn't really seem to be aware of how all the quote-unquote advice that she's given throughout this video go directly against the thesis that she started it with.
How indeed did this man go from injecting cyanide into an apple for Patrick Blackett in Cambridge to writing papers that were so admired by Heisenberg that the latter was suggesting a collaboration? We don't get to know. The journey across the night of Oppenheimer's academic awakening is played out with a mere smattering of scraps, wrapped in a stunningly gorgeous casing of absolutely useless nothing. A beautiful visual masterpiece of nothing, but nothing all the same. And as would repeatedly prove ruinous to Nolan's attempts at character development, all of this narrative distance would be traveled from some claustrophobic position within Oppenheimer's head, robbing the audience of any kind of context or sense of the world that he had begun to actively affect.
Why exactly do the specific dates here matter for a general audience member watching this film? Even if they don't know the exact dates of things that happen in this film, it's very easy for an audience member to pick up on the fact that the Cambridge timeline obviously happens first, and then that leads directly into the security hearing timeline, and obviously the Strauss timeline comes last as an epilogue. It's shown very clearly throughout the film, and the audience doesn't really need exact dates to figure that out. I honestly don't understand why she's so hung up on that fact either. Even without knowing the exact dates of when everything happened here in history, the greater story does make sense by the end of the film as a complete picture. It is very clear throughout this film that Nolan did make sure that everything lined up and made sense by the end of the film, even if exact dates weren't given, because really they weren't needed here. The advancement of time is still very obvious throughout this film overall.
By making Oppenheimer the main character of his own life story, he forced a score of other interesting characters to be largely irrelevant, except for when they brushed up against him.
Yeah, okay. Why exactly does that matter in a movie titled Oppenheimer? This movie is about Oppenheimer and his life. It's not about all the other people in his life. Hillary is so hung up on every other character outside of Oppenheimer himself, despite the fact the movie is quite literally about Oppenheimer, nobody else. It really just comes off as her trying to find some reason to dislike this film or Christopher Nolan himself, but constantly coming up empty-handed. It really begs the question why she even made this video to begin with if she doesn't actually have an argument here prepared at all. It really feels like she just made this thumbnail as rage bait, then tried to fill the video itself with some kind of semblance of an argument as to why Oppenheimer isn't actually a good film, but completely failed to do so. Actually, Oppenheimer should have been about all the characters except for Oppenheimer, not Oppenheimer himself. Give me a break here.
Of course, he was the main character, but when I say they were irrelevant, most of them never even spoke their names. Who they were outside of Oppenheimer's awareness didn't even seem to exist. The Dr. Lawrence of the radiation laboratory in Berkeley was introduced along with, "We're building a machine to accelerate electrons." He therefore gets the distinction of being the only scientist, other than Oppenheimer himself, whose field, area of specific interest, and contribution to the history of science is even alluded to. A flimsy kind of children's book illusion, but an illusion all the same. But as more and more individuals joined the Manhattan Project, the lack of information that the audience was being offered became increasingly glaring.
Because we don't need to know every single little detail about each specific person here. Now, what was it you tried to say before, Hillary, that too much complexity would bog down a narrative? While I still disagree with that, I will concede that adding too many elements and too many moving parts and minute details on top of a narrative can cause it to be bogged down, which ultimately is a different thing than adding more complexity. What you have done here in your entire exposition stating how you would rewrite this film ultimately is made it more bogged down than it already was. The film itself actually flows very well because we don't get so hung up on specific details about each person in the narrative. But according to your advice, if we did actually go into extreme detail about each person involved in the Manhattan Project, that would actually cause the film to be really bogged down. The film works because it only focuses on what really matters, and as a result, it flows very well. This is something that Hillary doesn't really seem to understand at all, and as a result, she's actually asking for things that would bog the film down without actually realizing it. It's absolutely mind-blowing.
I could allow that this was a creative choice to demonstrate Nolan's interpretation of Oppenheimer as self-absorbed, egotistical, and narcissistic, none of which characterizations to this degree I believe to be strictly fair, but to present the entire film from this warped perspective suggests that the portrayal of the facts themselves may be flawed by Oppenheimer's inflated sense of self-importance.
While this could have been a creative choice from Nolan himself to further show Oppenheimer's narcissism, you're still missing the point here. The film doesn't get hung up on extreme details about every single person involved in the Manhattan Project because that would bog the film down completely. If we really went into extreme detail about every single person on the Manhattan Project, even if we just spent 5 minutes on each of them, given the fact there were about 6,000 people involved in the making of the atomic bomb by 1945, this already 3-hour film would be 503 hours. Are you really telling me that you want to sit through a film that is 503 hours now? This is completely insane.
Nolan was so absorbed, almost obsessed with the Oppenheimer character he was creating, that the very idea that other characters might be relevant or important barely registered. Including them in the story felt almost like an afterthought. So trapped was his perspective behind the nose of his Oppenheimer that everyone else was sorely neglected. In contrast, let's look at a much better biopic, the brilliant Joe Wright film Darkest Hour about Winston Churchill. Churchill, like Oppenheimer, has become a figure that is larger than life. To say that it's possible to thoroughly know either of them now, when they have been dead for decades and their memory has metastasized into a marble monolith in the main thoroughfares of global history, isn't just absurd, it's arrogant. Wright understood this, Nolan did not.
Wow, okay, so you have the audacity to call Christopher Nolan arrogant when you have sat there for the last 40 minutes and try to lecture both Nolan and your audience on how to actually tell a story and try to say that Nolan was wrong for how he went about Oppenheimer and how this kind of story should be told, while at the same time showing you don't really know how biopics work, showing you don't really know how historical fiction works and how recounting history to a mass audience works, and also at the same time showing you don't even know how storytelling works, the thing you claim you know a lot about. You know what YouTube channel actually did a better job at showing they know how to recount history to a mass audience about Oppenheimer than Hillary did here? None other than epic rap battles of history of all people and their Oppenheimer versus Thanos rap battle. Even this freaking rap battle between Thanos of all people and J. Robert Oppenheimer shows more of an understanding for Oppenheimer and how to get his story across to a mass audience than frickin' Hillary. These are two guys who do silly rap battles on YouTube and she's a published author. How is this happening? This is definitely very laughable, but also kinda sad.
He used the character of Elizabeth Leighton, Churchill's secretary, a slightly fictionalized version of Churchill's actual secretary, to serve as a kind of every man or every woman on whose shoulders we could perch as she was drawn quite by chance into the orbit of Churchill's life. In many ways, Churchill, while the main subject of Darkest Hour, was not the main character. This allowed the other characters, both fictional and historical, room to exist outside the interpretation and perception of Churchill. Therefore, more of the story could be told from more perspectives for a fuller and more interesting picture.
Okay, but also Darkest Hour is a very different kind of movie than Oppenheimer. Like you just described here, Darkest Hour is more of an examination of the things that Winston Churchill did in his life from the perspective of Miss Leighton, whereas Oppenheimer is more of an examination of Oppenheimer as a person and his psyche. These are taking two different approaches to biopics here, and acting like all biopics should be the exact same, and if they're any different from Darkest Hour, they're automatically bad, is genuinely an insane take to have. especially when we consider the fact that all filmmakers are different and have their own unique voice and style. If they're making a biopic, they're likely going to be able to bring that unique voice and style to that story in a way that makes sense. Generally, filmmakers who are making biopics aren't picked to do them unless they really have the capability to do something truly incredible with the story of somebody in history, which in many ways is exactly what Oppenheimer was able to do.
Thus, Churchill is portrayed to be probably the most crucial, but definitely not the most important character in the story, just as he wasn't the most important character in that time in history. If you think about it, a wonderful alternative way to tell the story of Oppenheimer might have been through a fictional scientist at the Manhattan Project, who, perhaps, could have started as one of Oppenheimer's first students at Berkeley, who then could have remained by Oppenheimer's side all the way through the security hearing before the Grey Board. This non-existent scientist could have been the narrative device whose questions, what does that mean, why is this scientific discovery relevant, I don't understand how this device is expected to work, and so on, could allow Nolan the opportunities to explain the science in a way that wasn't too overt.
But that would completely miss the point of the film and the exploration of Oppenheimer's psyche itself. I have said this so many times now, but we are supposed to see things from his perspective to see just how his psyche was affected before and after the making and dropping of the bomb. If we, the audience, were viewing him through another character, then we wouldn't be able to really feel the impact that that had on him. It just would not work, and it definitely would not hit the same emotionally as seeing it directly through Oppenheimer's perspective, like we do in the final film. I do find it very ironic that this video from Hillary here is called Losing the Plot, when really it seems the only person who's actually lost the plot here is her. She has time and time again brought up things that don't matter here at all, constantly brought up actual history instead of storytelling like she said she was gonna at the start of this video, and also offered comparisons to other biopics that really don't make any sense at all when you look at the different kind of biopic that Oppenheimer is. And she's also offered a very bizarre unnamed rule that she seems to have made up that all biopics must abide by, that being they can't focus on the inner workings of a character. Which again doesn't even make any sense when you look at all the biopics that do follow this formula even outside of Oppenheimer, like Saving Mr. Banks and Better Man, like I brought up before. Heck, even something like The Social Network does this, diving into the minds of Mark Zuckerberg and also his friend Eduardo and what was going through their minds during the founding of Facebook. The film BlackBerry does this too, focusing on the inner mind of Jim Balsillie, the founder of BlackBerry. So to act like all biopics shouldn't do this and should have a specific rigid structure they should all follow by when they're being made doesn't make any sense at all.
The bottom line here is that aside from the horrendous damage done to development by this disjointed timeline situation, this needlessly acute focus on Oppenheimer and only Oppenheimer damages the narrative's ability to progress both the character and the story. But even more than that, Nolan's horrible failure to provide even a single ounce of context was, all by itself, enough to destroy this film 3 or 4 times over.
Okay, do you mind actually expounding upon your claim there and explaining why you think the film focusing on only Oppenheimer actually damages any development of his character? Because once again, you threw out that claim, but you didn't actually explain why you think that at all. This is some truly atrocious criticism here. And I have watched Jester Bell videos before. Honestly, I would say Hillary, at least so far, has proven herself to be no better than Jester Bell when it comes to actual media literacy. She cannot actually tell you why she thinks a film is bad. She can only go around in circles and repeat the same points over and over without actually expounding upon any of them at all. Despite the fact one is definitely more composed than the other, I would say Hillary really has proven herself to be no better than Jester Bell in terms of actually explaining her thoughts at all.
One terrible example. This man was never named or introduced by title or profession even once until he came forward with his damning testimony against Louis Strauss in Strauss's timeline, at which point we finally learned that he was Dr. David Hill. Nolan didn't even bother to tell us at this point Dr. Hill was the chairman of the Federation of American Scientists.
So this part is actually very interesting to me because if you read the book American Prometheus, which of course Oppenheimer as a film is mostly based on, the aspect of the meeting with Dr. David Hill actually isn't in the book at all. Nolan actually ended up digging through all the transcripts, which are all publicly available online, involving the courtroom hearings with Strauss to figure out what exactly happened with David Hill. It was through here that he figured out David Hill was one of the big people to initially expose Strauss, although he wasn't the first either. So naturally, he took a bit of artistic license here, adding something that wasn't initially featured in the book, but was a part of history into his film. This wasn't Nolan having a disastrous lack of context, this was him adding parts of history that weren't in the book he was adapting into the film to make for more context. If Hillary had actually done her due diligence and read the book that this film is directly based on, she would probably know this, but unfortunately it's very clear she didn't.
Even if that is, technically speaking, the most accurate term, I think of it more as the ultimate narrative question. A story always asks a question. It doesn't always answer it, but the story itself is always some kind of question. For Darkest Hour, it was, how did Churchill lead Britain into war against Hitler? That was the solid ground, the brick path through the forest that Wright had to stay firmly fixed to, lest his narrative get away from him. A good deal of the film Oppenheimer can only be explained if you imagine it as being a response to something, as if Nolan heard someone say something at a swanky dinner party one too many times and decided he had to respond to it.
This story is asking a question though. It's asking, what are the personal consequences of creating a weapon of mass destruction, and how does that affect the person who made it as well as everybody else around them? It's also asking, what exactly would lead someone to do something like that to begin with? These are the questions that the film directly poses to its audience and leaves it up to them to answer. It is designed as a film to get its audience to think and actually come to a conclusion for themselves, which is exactly what most Christopher Nolan films do to begin with. Nolan films tend to be the line between a cinephile film or more of a think piece and something that's more of a general blockbuster film for mass audiences. As a result, while they often are big blockbuster productions, they do get their audience to think more than most blockbusters generally try to do. They tend not to be the deepest things ever, but they generally have more going on under the hood than your average blockbuster. And naturally, that's also the case with Oppenheimer here as well.
This starting point is only pertinent or interesting if you're coming into the story from the perspective that the nuclear bomb's creators are the embodiment of peak human evil, that the existence of atomic weapons is itself an unforgivable sin for which someone has to be held accountable, or you believe that Oppenheimer was some kind of sainted science god who was publicly crucified by the AEC. The film was still put together with the apparently intended audience being one who has been operating under the delusion that the man Oppenheimer was either the sworn servant of Satan or he was as pure as the driven snow. And Nolan, moved as he was by the Spirit, had taken it upon himself to remind all of us that Oppenheimer was, in fact, human.
No, once again, Nolan was encouraging his audience to think and come to their own conclusions on the questions he's posing in this film, just like he does for most of his films. Hillary is so hung up on hating Nolan for some reason that she completely misses this as well. Does Hillary just assume all of the general audience watching this film is stupid and won't get what's going on the screen? You know, I'm starting to see why Hillary seems to have such a massive hate boner for Christopher Nolan now. Unlike her, he doesn't actually doubt his audience's intelligence at all. In fact, he consistently encourages them to think for themselves and really think deeply about film and come to their own conclusions on things. And he's able to do this through the guise of a modern blockbuster. Hillary, on the other hand, has come across throughout this entire video as someone who thinks she's better than everybody else and knows more about storytelling than anyone else around her. She consistently condescends and doubts an audience's intelligence. Nolan, on the other hand, recognizes that and encourages them to look deeper at a story. Funny enough, Nolan actually resembles more of a good storyteller in that sense by far. He's someone that is actively encouraging people to seek out and experience deep stories. Hillary, on the other hand, is doing the exact opposite and actively discouraging people from checking out deeper stories by having this very condescending, gatekeepy attitude. This is exactly why Nolan always has been, and as far as I can tell, always will be, a much better storyteller than Hillary. He actually respects his audience and encourages them to think deeper about media and experience it, which more than likely is exactly why there is so much animosity from Hillary towards Nolan. His attitude is the complete polar opposite of hers.
It is possible that communism and all its pomps and works need not have been such a central theme of this film. Of course, it is true that most films made by Hollywood taking place in the time immediately after the Second World War tend to be dominated to some degree by talks about communism this and communism that. But Nolan seemed to think that communism, again, without any context, political, historical, or social, was so important that he had to shoehorn it into each and every aspect of this story. If I'm being honest, if I have to watch this film one more time, I'm going to put my head through a plate glass window. Each misstep, each jumbled attempt at rhythmic pacing and cohesive plot development failed for these reasons. Excessive timelines and complexity, which represented Nolan's uncertainty about where the solid foundation of his story even was to start with. Horribly uneven pacing, a direct result of the first problem. A complete lack of context in any shape or form, and no clarity or even effort to establish clarity regarding the story's theme or framing. All of these problems are fatal, but they're also fixable. They're easy to avoid if you go into your storytelling with a firm grasp on the basic essentials of what any good story must have in order to be solid.
So let me ask you, what exactly do you consider the basic essentials for a story, Hillary? I already went in and debunked the 4 points you tried to make against Nolan's film here, but you have yet to actually provide any real writing advice or alternatives for this film or any kind of storytelling in general. Even at the very end of your video here, all you did was say storytelling requires the basic essentials, but you didn't even say what those basic essentials are. It is genuinely crazy to me, and it really shows exactly why you harbor so much animosity towards Christopher Nolan. Unlike yourself, Christopher Nolan actually does educate his audience on how to tell a story and how to do it well. He also isn't condescending and does consider his audience intelligent and tries to bring that intelligence out of them and also encourage them to check out good media. Throughout the entirety of this hour-long video, you have done none of those things at all and really just shown Christopher Nolan is a better storyteller than you. And for me, I definitely have some actual criticisms of Christopher Nolan's writing, like for instance how he often writes female characters. I do think that can be kind of lackluster sometimes. And personally, I'm not as big on the Dark Knight trilogy being seen as Batman movies as much as they are really good crime dramas using the Batman characters. I would consider something like The Batman to be an actually good live-action Batman movie. I would still definitely consider the Dark Knight trilogy good movies, more so the first two, although I wouldn't consider them good Batman movies, if that makes sense. But even though there are legitimate criticisms you can throw at Christopher Nolan, Hillary has shown she doesn't really have any interest at all in doing that. All she's really done here is create a very clickbaity, rage-baity thumbnail for a video and then fail throughout the entirety of that video to actually create any criticism for the movie she's supposedly criticizing. She knew Oppenheimer was a popular film and that's why she made this video, but she failed to actually create any real criticism for it. And also at the same time ended up proving that Christopher Nolan is a much better storyteller than her. Overall, this really isn't what criticism of writing and film should look like, but if you're interested, I do have a few channels that I recommend you check out if you want actual criticism of writing and film. First up, Filmento. Filmento is actually a channel I've watched for a while, and he has a lot of good advice for films that were failures and showing exactly how they became failures and how not to be like them when writing your own film. He also does cover a wide variety of genres of films such as war, superhero, horror, and plenty of others, so I definitely recommend him in general for having good range. On the other side of the coin, he'll often take a film that he thinks works or was a success and talk about what in its writing actually made it work as a film as well. I think he has a very good, very versatile range of writing advice, especially when it comes to film writing, so I definitely recommend him for sure. He's actually very good. Another one I recommend checking out is Savage Books, who talks about writing in TV shows and also films as well. He's done actually a lot of really good videos illustrating good writing in things like Pirates of the Caribbean, Samurai Jack, Star Wars The Clone Wars, The Devil Wears Prada, and things you've probably heard of, a lot of popular media like that in general. I definitely do recommend him quite a bit. The last one I would personally recommend would be none other than Patrick H. Williams, who I think is great and personally one of my favorite film YouTubers in general. He's definitely been on film YouTube for quite a while now and does know about a wide variety of films, but he always manages to make it very easy for a general audience to understand what he's talking about. He knows about a pretty wide variety of films, including more niche stuff, but he doesn't act like he's better than anyone else for knowing about that stuff. Unlike, say, Hillary, of course, here. Regardless, I hope this video was enlightening for you and hopefully helped turn you on to what real film criticism looks like in general, or maybe helped you understand what good story advice looks like too. That's really the big reason I do these videos anyway, to hopefully educate people on what real criticism looks like and what real story advice looks like in general. And thankfully, it does look like hunting grizzly bears is paying off since channels like Jesterbell, Geeks and Gamers, Clownfish TV, and plenty of others have been losing viewership as people have kind of realized they're not real critics as time has gone on. So it does look like me doing the kinds of videos I do here is paying off, so thank you to everybody that watches these videos and supports them. I'm looking forward to doing a lot of stuff here in 2026. I'll obviously be hunting more grizzly bears of course, but I have other projects planned too. I'm gonna be finally publishing the James Gunn and Nickelodeon movie rankings this month since I finally watched the latest Nickelodeon movie, that being The Search for SquarePants, which was certainly something. So look forward to me enduring a lot of pain before some actually good movies in that Nickelodeon ranking later this month. As for the rest of the year, I am still working on a video about Kingdom Hearts 1 that is getting very long, so look forward to that as well. I personally think Kingdom Hearts 1 is the best game in the series, and I want to talk about why I think that. And maybe I'll talk about Kingdom Hearts 2 later this year as well, since it is the 20th anniversary. Another project I am working on is how J.K. Rowling can't write autistic coded characters, so stay tuned for that. That should be out this month actually as well. As for the rest of the year, I'll just take it as it comes. Whatever idea I come up with and want to put in a video, I'll do that. I really just love talking about film, animation, and gaming overall, and thankfully I'm lucky enough to have a good community that supports what I do and likes what I do as well. So thanks everybody for supporting my videos last year and making for a very good year overall. I'm looking forward to what 2026 has to offer. If you like this video, be sure to give it a like and also consider subscribing as well. I do lots of videos on film and animation overall, so if you like this video, you'll probably like the other videos I have planned as well. If you'd like to hang out with like-minded film and animation fans overall, you can check out my Discord, which is linked in the description. You can also follow me on all my socials and check out my letterbox, which is linked down below for all my written film reviews. Special thanks to all my patrons and YouTube members who keep me doing what I do here monetarily. I appreciate y'all a ton for pitching in with the extra monetary effort. I appreciate you all for coming to the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed it or learned something new from it. But for now, I've been Otterly Noah, and I'll see you on the other side. Bye!